Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode 109, and today we're going to try to answer why top players win more, and more importantly, even how can you become one of those top players, and what steps do you need to take, and what order of those steps you probably should take in order to move from where you are currently into this top echelons. And when you're in the top, well, it's also good for you to know what the other top players are doing. So let's go through that. But of course, it wouldn't be possible for me to do that without the sponsorship from mtgazone.com. This seminar is going to be, it's a 75% finished article that I'm hopefully going to finish today or tomorrow and submit. Also, this wouldn't be possible without the patrons who are keeping me motivated to churn those out every week. And trust me, you very much underestimate the power of my patrons. I sometimes spend the whole week thinking like, oh, do I have to do it? And then I look at my Patreon and I think, yes, I do. I kind of disappoint those people who are so amazing and supporting me. We don't have any new patrons this week, but maybe next week you can be the change that everyone needs. Blah blah blah. Okay. Before we move into the main topic, or actually, this is a part of the main topic, as we are, I'm going to start with my traditional preamble, and this time is education follows a carefully designed structure. And it's very important that education does that because that allows people to move through the stages of education that are designed over generations to make it easy. My daughter is learning how to play piano right now, and of course, it's all sort of finger exercises and simple melodies that she's playing ad nauseum, to my very much detriment because I have to listen to them, but to her benefit because these finger exercises are there for a reason. You cannot just buy yourself a keyboard and start playing Chopin concerto in F minor because probably you won't be able to do that. In order to get to the stage where you can actually play the Chopin concerto, you need to go through stages. When you start with those finger exercises, when you start with how to play the chords, with how to read the music, then you move to the simple melodies, to more complicated songs, and at some stage, if you go deep into piano playing, you will eventually be able to play the Chopin concerto passably. Uh, what I find problematic in magic is that magic education is not structured at all. It's an amalgam of advice from different people. There is no structure to it. You don't have like a manual. You don't have a program that you can follow in order to become amazing. And this is, to an extent, detrimental, I think, in how people can learn magic. And I think, especially in limited, it is really hard to get into it. And I think that a lot of people are not starting to draft because draft is a harder form of magic in a way, because you don't only need to know how to play the game, you also need to know the specifics of a given set. You are going to be playing against people that probably know more than you, so there is this obstacle of you are going to lose probably quite a lot in the beginning. Something that doesn't necessarily happen in constructed, because in constructed you can get the tier one deck that was built by someone who is really skillful in building tier one decks, and because of that you will have at least some wins on your account just from the fact that you're playing a very good deck. The problem in limited is, of course, you need to be able to build a very good deck yourself, and that's very hard when you're just starting. There are financial issues, but we're not going to talk about it in detail, because we all know drafts are also costing, and because they're costing, people who are losing a lot are not that keen on paying some for something that will eventually also cost them money, because they will not be winning it that much. But what I find, one thing that can be changed and probably should be changed in magic education, is adding a bit more specificity on information. Who is this information beneficial for? And I know that some content creators, like Corticals is really good at it, are doing that. When they are telling you what to do in a limited game or in a draft, they will frequently tell you that this is a sort of an advice for an early drafter or a drafter that just began. And some of his advice will be aimed more at the intermediate players. And I think that there is a very good point on dividing your advice on how to draft depending on where the person receiving that advice currently is. So today we are going to be looking at the data from different tiers of 17 lands win rate. 17 lands data is divided in 3 tiers of players. We're going to talk about what those tiers are, but they basically differ in their win rate on average across multiple formats. And it's not a perfect proxy. I don't want to say that the top tier players are the best players, but you also cannot ignore the fact that those people are winning over 60% of their games. So yeah, before we dive into the main topic, actually, we're going to do a bit of a catch up on the metagame evolution of the format. I've done it on Saturday, so keep in mind a couple of days have passed since I did the numbers, so maybe there are some minor changes. There shouldn't be too much of it, but there is some. And let's start with the play rate of the decks. The important two things that happened over the first between the week 1 and week 2 of the format is Selesnya is becoming more and more popular. It's not surprising. Selesnya is also winning quite a lot, so people are starting drafting it more and more. On day 1, I think it was around 8%, and then on week 1, it was around 9.4%. Now it's around 10.8% of all the decks are Selesnya decks, of all the 2-color decks. Boros is still the most drafted deck, 16.5. It used to be 16.3, so not much change there. I think that you can't realistically draft more than 16.5% of that at the current stage, especially that people who are not 17 lens users seems to be catching up that Boros is the thing, and the color pair is becoming a bit overdrafted, I would even say. Azorius has dropped down in its popularity. It was the second most popular deck after week 1, but now it's only third. Dropped from 11.4 to 10.2. There was a big drop in Rakdos from 6.3 to 4.9%. That deck is not winning, and people just weaned off of it. And the big shift is here in Simic, which started as the least popular deck and now is somewhere there in top 5 at 6.2%. It started at 4.2. And looking at the win rates of those decks, there has been a big drop of the win rate in Boros decks. They started the first week at 60.2% win rate. Now they are at 58. So 2.2 percentage points drop. And again, I think that most of it is due to the fact that people started drafting more and more of Boros, especially those less involved players. They heard limited resources talking about Boros being good. They've seen some content, whatever, and that has resulted in the drop of the win rate. So despite still being top deck, I would say that Boros is no longer the place to be. Selesnya also had a small drop of 1 percentage point. It was 58.2% over the first week and then dropped to 57.2% win rate, so 1 percentage point drop. Third deck in terms of win rate is Simic, and we've been waiting for that time for a long time, and finally we got there. Simic is actually a competitive archetype. Actually, in top players, it's doing even better than that. Now I have to think very hard. Do I have the top player data graphs after that? We'll see in a second, I guess. Azorius also dropped in win rate, and that's despite being played less. So I don't know. I think that Azorius benefited a lot from week 1 environment when lots of things were going later. But now that those super good white commons are contested, Azorius is not good anymore because you need those good white commons in order for it to be pretty strong. Chat already with the hot takes. Birthday Boy Squealer saying that green is the strongest color, not white. And it is a hot take, but it's not an outrageous take. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if at the end of the format we are going to be thinking that this was a green format in a way. What else do we have? Izzet is staying more or less the same. Orzhov is staying more or less the same. There's been a slight drop in Gruul decks. Golgari stays the same, but that's pretty low anyway. So does Rakdos. And there was even a bigger drop for Dimir, which started as the worst archetype and consolidated its position as the weakest archetype. Now let's look at the metagame evolution of the top players. And here we do see that Boros is the most drafted, and you see that it's drafted at around 19%. It didn't change much across the first week, between the first week and the second week, but it's drafted around 2-3 percentage points higher than in the general population. So the top players were on Boros, and they were basically forcing it for the first week and for the second week as well. Then we see an even bigger shift in Selesnya. People knew that Selesnya is good, and they reacted accordingly. And therefore, we see almost a 3 percentage point increase in drafting Selesnya between week 1 and week 2. from 11.4 to 14.2, and that's much more than it was in the general population. More than 3 percentage points difference in terms of how popular Selesnya is. Drop in Azorius, even bigger. So people are weaning off Azorius, and I think for the right reason as well. We see also some drop in Orzhov. We see some drop in Rakdos, and we see the same trend. We see the increase in Simic being played by the top players. And if we look at the win rates, after week 1, Boros was the top archetype in terms of win rate. In week 2, at least until I measured it, a very slight advantage, but Simic is actually the top winning archetype among the top players on 17 lands. So we are living in beautiful times where actually Simic is a competitive, and even some might say, in some metrics, a top deck in the format. So that's something that we haven't seen in approximate 84 years. But generally, I would say, yeah, Simic, Boros, Selesnya are the top 3 decks. Selesnya did have a significant drop-off from 62.7 to 60.2%, but it's still third. And then we have like a long plateau until of the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 archetypes, which are roughly the same for the top players. This has not been the same in the general population when we go back. The drop-off starts a bit earlier with Golgari, Rakdos, and Dimir. The top players actually managed to make Golgari work to some extent. So that's the big difference. Dimir is doing really, really bad also for top players. Mind that this has been based on a pretty small sample size. And Rakdos is doing pretty poorly. Azorius, you can see, is third from last. So that drop in draft prevalence is based on, I think, experience of the players who didn't see the Azorius decks perform particularly well. Again, I'm telling that one of the reasons for that is that those white commons have been much more heavily contested right now. And when you strip Azorius decks from those top white commons, it doesn't become something that is super interesting for you to play. Interestingly, Orzhov is doing quite well because I think Black has its merits in Orzhov shells, and good players are capable of doing that. Keep in mind that they do play Orzhov not that much, so probably there is some effect of them being very careful about when they play Orzhov and going into that archetype when there is a very good reason for doing so. Generally, we see also that the win rates have dropped by quite a lot compared to week 1. So week 2 is full percentage points, if not more, probably even more, because Boros was so overdrafted and dropped by quite a lot. Difference in the general win rate of those top players between week 1 and week 2. So people are catching up, and this removes that edge of early knowledge that top players usually have. They're still win, 59, 60% of the games, which is not terrible. And then one more thing I wanted to look at is the deviation from the mean. So in this graph, you will see the deviation from the average win rate for the cohort. And I look at 2 cohorts. One of them is top players, so the people that are classified in 17 lands as top players, which is roughly 10% of the data. And the other category is all the 17 lands users, but excluding those top players, so the other 90% of the data. And I wanted to see if there are any interesting differences in here. You can see that the trends are roughly the same. So Boros is the highest diversion from the mean upwards, 3.4 percentage points more in case of all the other users, and 2.4 percentage points when you look at only top players. Then we have the Selesnya, which has the 1.6% deviation from the mean upwards. So the win rate is 1.6 percentage points higher for all the players except the top players, and around 1% for the top players. And here we come to the interesting point. Simic has a negative deviation for all the users, around 0.6, so roughly on that average level. But for the top players, it's 1.5 percentage points above the mean win rate of those players. So there is it goes in different ways. And similarly, But inversely, Azorius has slightly higher win rate on average for all the 17 lens users, but for the top players, it has below average win rate for them. Then we have Izzet, which is slightly below rate for both groups. Orzhov, which is consistently 0.7% below the average win rate, which is fine actually when you think about it. 0.7 below average is not a terrible thing. It's within the margin of error, I would say. Then we have the decks that drop off quite sharply. In Gruul, just above 1 percentage point below the average for both groups. And we have Golgari, which is like almost 3 percentage points below the average for all the users, except for the top players, but only 1.2 for the top players. And I will be monitoring that because I think that there are good Golgari decks, but maybe they are not the obvious ones. And I think that maybe, all the 17 lens users are memeing a bit too much with slimes and roots and chalk outline, but maybe there are good Golgari decks hidden somewhere in there that don't necessarily utilize those cards. And then we have Rakdos and Demir. Both are doing way below the average. Rakdos 3 percentage points for both groups. Demir almost 4 percentage points below the average for both groups. So I would say avoid Rakdos and Demir. That is not to say that they're unplayable. I think that there exists a very good Rakdos build. I've met it once and it completely thrashed me based on 1-drops and 2-drops and super aggressive and low to the ground 16 lands kind of I win in 6 turns or I don't win kind of strategy that is boosted by giving suspect to things like red herring and pushing damage through that. Okay. This concludes the metagame breakdown and how it changed since we last met. Now let's look at the main topic. And let's start with brief explanation. What are those top, mid, and bottom 17lands.com tiers? 17lands divides players into several categories. Most of the data is from uncategorized players. These are the ones that don't play enough to be in any category. In order to be in one of the tiers, you need to play enough games across enough formats. So this is for like super invested players, really. Probably around 30-40% of the data will be classified in one of the tiers. But still, 60% will not be classified. So keep that in mind. In general, bottom tier is players who have around 50% win rate. For this set, it's been 47.9% win rate on average for the people that are in the bottom tier. The middle tier are the players who have around 55% win rate, 55.7 in case of this format. And top players are the ones who have the win rate of around 60%, 60.4 for this particular format. So I'm going to be looking at a couple of metrics that are specific for those players. One of them is going to be, and I'm going to start with it, is which cards are picked more aggressively and why. And how I'm going to measure? I'm going to measure in 2 different ways. First, we're going to look at one graph that looks at the metric that is almost never talked about, ATA, the ugly sister of ALSA. This is the average taken at. It tells you which pick do people take a particular card on average at. And it is linked to ALSA because, of course, ALSA of the card, so when it's seen in the packs, will determine when you can take the card. I mean, you can't take a card with ALSA of 2 at pick 8 because it will almost never be seen at pick 8. But some cards can be seen quite later and still will be taken earlier by that. And the interesting part for me here is which cards are particularly early taken by the top players, but not necessarily by the non-top players. So I'm going to look at the delta difference. So the next graph we're going to look at is going to show you the number of picks or fraction of a pick. How earlier do top players take a given card than the bottom tier in this particular case. So when you see those numbers, 0.87 for Get a Leg Up, it means that Get a Leg Up is taken roughly 0.9 picks earlier by the top players when they see it than by the bottom players. And almost one pick difference is quite a lot, actually. Get a leg up is a card that top players value highly. They see it, and despite not having to pick it, because that card goes pretty late, they will pick it because they think it's just good enough, and they think they disagree with what community tells you about the card. Community tells us about the card that its alpha is around 7 point something. It wheels frequently, therefore it's not really good. Top players think it is good, and I do agree with top players on that one. Get a leg up is green mana for an instant. Target creature gets +X, where X is the number of creature you control, and it gains reach, which is this sort of most secret of reaches in this format. I killed the Niv Mizzet yesterday with that card just by playing it on a 2/2 morph creature and giving it +5/+5 and reach. So that's one of the cards that top players do value more than the community in general. Second card that is really picked much more highly by the top players is A Killer Among Us, and that card is going to, well, it's not an accident that this card was in the in my thumbnail for this episode. I think that this card is the definition of a card that you need to learn some things about drafting in order to fully appreciate it. And this card is picked way too late. It's the top uncommon in the format, or there and abouts in top 3 of the uncommons, and it goes later than cards that are having miserable stats because people don't see the power of that. Actually, it's a card that defines how I draft this format because I so frequently see it late and pivot into green that I end in green decks disproportionately frequently because I just can't say no to A Killer Among Us. And that leads me to some dodgy lanes of draft. But enough about me. Top players are also using it very highly, and they have very good results with it. So why wouldn't they? Another card that we have, there is a whole cluster of the cards that are between 0.6 and 0.5 picks, picked higher by the top players. On the job, the +2/+1 to all your creatures plus investigate combat trick, the sort of like go white combat trick, that's picked higher. And here I think that this is the kind of a card that white decks want a one copy of, and top players will just pick it earlier just in order to make sure to have it, because some of the decks will not function great without having a copy or two of this card. Sanitation Automaton is another thing that top players value highly. It looks inconspicuous. It's the 2 mana colorless artifact creature, a 2/1 that surveils one on ETB. Just a 2-drop in this format is a good thing. And a bit of card selection and maybe a bit of graveyard synergies with it, that's just gravy on top of it. So top players pick it early because often when you have a pack where you have like maybe a medium 3-drop, medium 4-drop in your colors and Sanitation Automaton, it's just better to pick Sanitation Automaton, not necessarily to play it, but to have the option of having more 2-drops in case you are running short on 2-drops in this format. Another card, Eliminate the Impossible. That's the 2 mana blue combat trick, question mark. Gives -2/-0 to creatures your opponent controls, and you investigate. Very good way of winning combats, especially you can swing or make multiple blocks with that card and not worry too much about the outcome, because giving -2/-0 to your opponent's creature is going to definitely make the combat math in your favor compared to where it started. Auspicious Arrival is also in that group, +2/+2 combat trick, and you see a certain theme. And the irony of the how good are the combat tricks being asked in the last episode? Well, we have some really good data on combat tricks in this episode. So Searing Blaze, if you're listening, top players definitely prioritize the combat tricks. They pick them higher than their alpha would suggest. We also have Repulsive Mutation, another card that I very often pick late because I see it in the pack. That's the blue-green X spell. It says put X +1/+1 counters on target creature, and then you counter target spell unless its opponent pays X, where X is the highest power among the creatures you control. It's really a great card. By the way, the counter is May, so you don't have to counter anything. You can just use it as a spell that puts a bunch of counters on your creature. Counter, two different meanings of the same word, but okay, I hope you figure that one out. But it can counter a spell. It can just act as a combat trick. It can do both by countering a spell in combat and making one of your blockers bigger, if you have that option. So very, very useful. If you have big creatures, you can just have it as a 2 mana counter spell for most of the time. So that's another great functionality of it. And card is good. It is in a good archetype because, as we have established, Simic is the place to be in this format. And it still goes quite late. Top players are not getting fooled by it going late. They know it's good and they pick it early. Chase is on, another combat trick, the +3/+0 first strike trick that makes you investigate. This is also picked by almost a half pick higher by the top players compared to the bottom players. Person of interest, make 2/2/2s. One of them is a detective, one of them is a suspect. A love story that's not meant to happen. This is a very good payoff for the go wide decks. You can play multiple of those if you're super aggressive. And I guess that top players want to be aggressive in this format, especially in those first weeks when Boros was the thing to do. In the first week, they were high on person of interest because it was an important card for that particular archetype. Then we have Course to Kill. That's around 0.4 picks, higher picked by the top players. Another card that I think the top players, and we're going to talk about that card later, pick it higher because they splash it. It's a very easy splash. You don't want to be playing Demir because, as we saw, it has atrocious win rate, but you do want to play Course to Kill because that card is just amazing, and thus people splash it in their blue-green decks, for example, as I did several times already, and I was quite happy to do so because I got like super late Course to Kill, and splashing a swamp and a couple of nervous gardeners in your Simic deck is not something that is very difficult for you to do. Evidence Examiner, another Simic card. Top players know that Simic is good enough to prioritize those cards, and they do it. Escape Tunnel, your Evolving Wilds of the format. That card is important when you're splashing things like Course to Kill, for example. Glint Weaver, that's the 7 mana 3/3 that on ETB puts 3+1/+1 counters on something, then you gain life equal to the highest power or toughness, something you control. Great card as a top end for a controlling deck that spends the beginning of the game struggling for life, and once it crosses the 7 land threshold, you can play Glint Weaver, gain 6 life or more, and clog the board, and hopefully be capable of turning the corner from there. Festerich, that's the 1-drop black creature that mills you when it connects with the opponent and can grow. Very good early drop that will push some damage. Threat of activation is quite large on this thing, and top players are drafting it highly. And Reckless Detective, the 0/3 that can ramage or sacrifice an artifact to draw a card when it attacks, and then it becomes 2/3 instead of 0/3 that it is on face value. So these are the cards that are valued high by the top players in terms of how they pick those cards. Keep those in mind. By the way, thanks to the well-known data lover, Mr. Metronome, for the raid. I appreciate that he understands how important data is in Magic and promotes it at every step of his content creation. So thanks for that. Other way of looking at the same thing of how people prioritize cards is looking at the pick preference. And this is a very simple thing you can calculate from those tables that you find in 17 Lens website. You can see how many times people have seen a card and how many times did they pick a card. And by dividing those two numbers, you get what percentage of the time they pick the card when they see it. And that's exactly what I did. And here we're going to compare different tiers. And maybe to start, before we go into the cards, why do I want to compare different tiers? Because I think that there are different things to learn from different comparisons. And it will all depend on where you think you are as a player in terms of your limited skills. Everyone would want to be in the top tier, and I'm sure that lots of people in the chat and lots of my viewers are. I've seen some casually dropped win rates of players going, just shy of 70% here. I mean, these players are definitely in the top group, but not everyone is in that top group. If your win rate is 50%, fine, you're learning. Embrace that fact and understand where you are standing. Knowing what is your skill level at the current moment is something that is important for your development, because if you know where you are, you know what you should be learning, or at least you should be knowing if we had a good program of how to teach magic and how to learn magic, which, as I said in the preamble, we don't necessarily do. But what I thought is, if you're learning and you're in that group of the bottom players, so your win rate is around 50%, again, no shame in that. The best thing for you to do is to look what are people in the next group doing, because you probably are not going to jump from the bottom tier straight to the top tier. You need to go through certain stages, and one of those stages is going to be this 55% win rate in the middle. I'm not saying that those things are linearly lasting the same. I know that some players, they start drafting and they are in this 50% win rate group, and then 3 seasons later or 3 4 months later, they are all of a sudden having 65% win rate because they grinded a lot of drafts. But some of you will take longer for that. No shame in that, again, because we all can't play 7 drafts a day and spend 7 hours a day to consume content. In order for you to cross that limit, you probably should see what are people right above you doing. And that's why we have this graph. And here we have a graph that looks at the comparison between middle and bottom players. And the numbers here will show you what is the percentage point difference in picking a particular card in terms of how many times you see it and how many times you pick it. And from this, we can learn that Neighborhood Guardian is the top difference card between the middle and the bottom tiers. So people that are in this 55% win rate kind of bracket will pick the Neighborhood Guardian 8.5 percentage points higher. So if the people in the bottom tier pick it 25% of the time they see it, the middle tier will pick it 33.5% they see it, which is some decent difference between how people treat the card. And when I went to the pre-release, I opened Neighborhood Guardian. I played a couple of games with it, and I tweeted after that, when I showed my pre-release deck on Twitter, I said, no matter how highly you think you should be drafting Neighborhood Guardian, it's probably higher than that. And obviously, I do love magic hyperbole, and I lean into it quite consciously. So I tried to make those super exaggerated statements that almost seem grotesque. But in this case, I was honestly thinking, yeah, most people will probably undervalue how good this card is, and they should be picking it high. So I thought, I know that for maybe 10% of the people it will be a grotesque piece of advice, but for the 90% of people that read it, it's probably going to be a good advice. Just pick it higher. And why? Well, this creature is a 2-mana 2/2, which is already good in this format. On face value, like a vanilla 2/2 would be good, or decent at least, and especially in those colors. But it's so much more than that. You play it on turn 2. On turn 3, you play a disguised creature, and your Neighborhood Guardian becomes a 3/3. It can probably attack. So you push 3 damage through because you played another creature. Next turn, you can attack with it and your disguised creature. And what is your opponent supposed to do? You can have a choice of combat trick. You can unflip something and make more creatures, like a Dog Walker, and give +1/+1 to 2 different targets. So depending on what blocks they are going to do, you can make sure that your one creature survives and the other one pushes more damage, or something like that. It puts your opponent so much on the back foot, especially when you're on the play. And I think that this is a super important card. I was just literally, before I started watching before I started streaming, I was watching the stream of Paul Cheon, and he had a pick in one of his packs. It was between the Neighborhood Guardian and the Novice Inspector, and he picked Novice Inspector. I thought that the pick was Neighborhood Guardian. I still think that the card is that good that I would pick it so high. What we also see from this graph, except for focusing on Neighborhood Guardian, which is the top difference, we see that there is a trend in there. We see cards like Inside Source, Novice Inspector, Reckless Detective, Torch to Witness, Case of the Gateway Express, Dog Walker, Case of the Burning Masks, Fast Bother. These are all cards that will be very good in Boros deck. So what we see from here is not only the preference for individual cards, but also the preference for particular color combination. And in this first 2 weeks data, there was definitely a preference of Boros that was higher in those middle tier players. So if you are in this bottom tier, you might start looking, especially in those first 2 weeks. I'm not saying that this is going to be good advice going forward, because I think that Boros right now is overdrafted. But if the format is starting, those middle tier players will know what's going on and which color to is the thing to be drafting, and they will have a slight increased preference for that color pair, and that's clearly visible in this data, that those middle tier players were drafting Boros more, and not necessarily by being better players, but by positioning themselves better in the metagame. They were capable of winning more games. So if you think that you might be in this bottom tier, if you think that your win rate is probably around 50%, maybe 52, maybe 48, something like that, maybe what you should be starting to think at the beginning of the format, if you want to improve, is to be more knowledgeable about what's good. And that doesn't require too much work. You go on 17 lands after 2 days, you look at which color pairs win the most, you look through some trophy decks, see what's in them, and that's all the information you need to jump that hoop. So just be more knowledgeable about what's going on early. Don't wait for that to be told to you in week 1.5 or week 2, because by that it might be too late and you will be now basing on outdated knowledge from the first week. This is also another, like, it's not exactly secret because they're in the open, but most games that you see in the data for the first weeks is going to be week 1 data, because most games are being played in this week 1. So the win rates are very frequently going to be slightly outdated once you start looking at data in week 2, 3, or 4, because obviously the best color is not going to be as open as it was in the first days of the format. So one thing to do if you are in the 50% win rate bracket, make sure your knowledge is up to date. Invest 15 minutes to look through 17 lands and find out what's going on in the first 2 days, and then act accordingly. So increase your preference for those high win rate color pairs, because probably they are slightly open in those first days. What else do we see in this data? Cryptic code. The 2 and a blue equipment, when it ETBs, you turn the top card of your library into a 2 mana disguised creature, basically. And you can, if it's a creature, you can flip it for its mana cost. It gets +1/+0 and unblockable. So it's a 3/2 unblockable for 3 mana with ward. And then you can return Cryptic Code to your hand and repeat the process if you want to. So you can just start generating as many 2/2s as you can afford, and one of them will be a 3/2 and unblockable. So yeah, it's a great card. It's one of the most busted rares in the format. It's a card with the constructed pedigree, and those middle win rate players are much more willing to pick this card when they see it, and maybe try to splash it, or maybe try to shift their draft a bit. Like, maybe they were like white card, red card, and then they see Cryptic Code, they just pick Cryptic Code, and all of a sudden they're white blue. That's a very random example there, but just try to imagine how you can switch from playing, remove your secondary color in order to put blue, in order to play Cryptic Code, because you have one of the most powerful cards in the format. Lamplight Phoenix, another example. That's a card that is, of course, it would be good in Boros, but I think it still counts as one of those bomb category cards. That's a 3 mana 3/3 flyer, and when it dies, you can collect evidence, and if you do, it returns to the battlefield. So hard to kill, evasive threat, really good. And if you're in Selesnya, but you maybe have a couple of green cards, picking up Lamplight Phoenix is a good strategy in order to maybe shift from Selesnya to Boros, and worst case scenario, you just got yourself 20 gems at some stage. Killer Among Us is one of those cards that is picked higher by the middle tier players. We talked about the card already. It is maybe a difficult card to understand, but I think that the best way of imagining it is, we know that this 3/3 plus a 1/1 is a good card for 4 mana. It's been good in many formats. Usually the 3x creature has some small bonus, like it had flying in LCI, it had unearth in Brothers War, it had haste in Phyrexia Obi-Wan, but that combination of like a bigger body coming with a smaller body was always good. And Killer Among Us is just that, but better, because it makes 3 bodies, of one of which will most likely become a 4/4, which is bigger than a 3/3. It might have even Death Touch for a turn. It also has like niche synergies by putting 4 colors of permanence on board. Might come up if you play the colorless case in your deck. And the cards wins a lot of games. Part of its high win rate is because it's so disproportionately played by top players. So keep that in mind when you look at the win rates of cards. Some of them will have an inflated win rate because better players play the card, which is like sort of weird interaction between best players draft the card, it gets high win rate. The best players follow the win rate information more aggressively, and therefore they will draft even more of that card, which will increase its draft rate. And you got this kind of weird feedback loop with cards like this. What else do we have? Novice Inspector. I think that this is a kind of a card that if you don't understand why it's good, you should start thinking about it. Because this is not obvious why Novice Inspector is such a good card. It's 1 mana 1/2, makes a clue, whatever. 1/2 is blanked by almost everything in the format, and somehow this becomes the top common of the format still. Yes, Murphykins, you can ask questions. If it's to this slide, you can ask them whenever you want. And if not, I will do after the seminar a bit of question time, as I always do. And, similar. Yeah, it requires some practice. And I can't tell you exactly why it is so good in 5 seconds in here. I mean, I could. It produces a body that has many uses. It's card neutral because in the end you're going to draw a card. It generates this extra cardboard. It does so many things. It fills the place on the mana curve that is actually not very much contested in this format because there's not so many good 1-drops. There's so many things. And that one body, that 1/2, maybe it's useless when you start dropping 2/2s, but at certain stage on turn 5, when you attack with like 4 creatures and you have on the job in hand and you can cast on the job and turn them into big things, having that one extra body is super important. So there's many things that it does very well. And late in the game is just like, yeah, I put a blocker or maybe attacker or whatnot, and I draw a card instantly. So for 3 mana. Yeah, it does a lot. It's like not dead late in the game as often 1-drops will be, because it always sort of cycles itself. And combat tricks exist, and top players use combat tricks better, and even medium skill level players use combat tricks better. So that's another thing in its repertoire. You have the things like Case of the Gateway Express, which is much better when you start 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, and then Case of the Gateway Express, than if you start 2-drop, 3-drop, and then Case of a Gateway Express. That's the one that creatures you control deal damage to a target, which is also one of those cards that middle players pick more highly. But even if you don't understand it, at least acknowledge the fact that you see this card at the top of the win rate. You see top players picking this card higher, and start thinking on your own. Why do you think this card might be good? Start experimenting with it. Start trying to think when you cast it where this card has been good. So if you start doing it, that's the best way, I think, of growth. Trying to figure it out on your own, what's good, but using information from others on what is good, and not trying to rediscover the wheel we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and we should be using those shoulders to our advantage. And I guess that Reckless Detective is a similar card in a way, because I think that maybe more beginner player will think 2 mana for an O3 that doesn't sound appealing, and then if I want to attack with it, I need to make sure that I can ramage something, or sacrifice an artifact. I don't know if I want to do that. But actually, when you think about it, you so often want to ramage in those decks. 2/3 is a good body because it can attack early and probably won't be challenged, so it will push some damage. You will have some clues running around, and you can think of Reckless Detective as a creature that allows you to sacrifice those clues for 0 mana, which is a good bonus, honestly. If you play turn 1 Novice Inspector, turn 2 Reckless Detective, turn 3 you attack with Reckless Detective, sacrifice the clue, draw a card, cast a 3-drop, happy times. And you drew a card. So yeah, great. Torch to Witness. I don't know, this card, if you listen to some content, you frequently hear that those X spells are not good. And normally it's so true, because normally X spells deal X damage. But Torch to Witness deals 2 times X damage, which completely changes the equation. The fact that also it most of the time will generate a clue means it replaces itself, which makes it into an incredible card and should be picked very highly, because this is probably the best removal spell in the set. And it still goes relatively late, and those lower win rate players are not picking it probably high enough. You know, if you have if your opponent casts a 6/6 creature, if you have an X spell, you need 7 mana to kill it, which is usually inaccessible for a deck that is aggressive, because usually you play fewer lands, you ramage them, or you try not to draw too many of them. Torch to Witness kills that 6 toughness creature for 4 mana, or 5 if you want to have a clue, which is a good deal. And it has a range of doing things in between. So yeah, like for 2 mana, you can just kill a 1/1, get a clue, and you're happy. Then you have Tolsimir. Tolsimir is an obvious bomb, and don't get me wrong, the players with 50% win rate know that. They pick it highly. They just don't pick it as highly as the players in the middle tier. And ironically, people that have win rate of 50% probably should pick it higher than any other group, because this is the card that has the smallest delta in win rate between the top players and the bottom players. So independently of your skill level, of your win rate, Tolsimir has relatively even win rate, because the card has so much raw power that it's really hard to misplay with it. Possible, but harder. What else do we have here? Flourishing Bloomkin. I think that this is another interesting example of a card that might be underappreciated by people who are beginning to play limited. This is the 2 mana 2-drop. 2 mana 2-drop. Yeah, and unlike the 3 mana 2-drops, this is a 2-drop, and it has X power and toughness, where X is the number of forests you control. The Bloomkin also can be played as a disguise creature, and then you can flip it up for 5 mana. And if you flip it up, you can get 2 forest cards from your library. Keep in mind, forest cards, not forests. So not basic forest. So you can take a green survey land, for example, and you put one of those cards on the battlefield and one in your hand. So most of the time, I think that lots of those early players will think of Bloomkin as a sort of like almost mono green kind of card. But actually, it is a pretty decent card if you are heavily-ish green in your deck. Because if you flip it on turn 5, you probably have like 2 forests on board, if not 3 already. You put 1 extra because you instantly put 1 in, on board. It will flip into like a 3/3 or a 4/4, while drawing you 2 cards, basically. Even though there are lands, but you probably in green, you are quite kind of mana hungry. If you have a surveillant, it also can act as fixing plus card selection, which is super great. And later in the game, it will very frequently become like a 7/7 or even more than that. So yeah, good card. You should probably evaluate it a bit more as a generically good card, not only a mono green card. And we have the Coerce to Kill. Another thing, you don't want to be playing Demir that much because that's the weakest archetype, it seems. But you want to be playing the Curse to Kill, and when you playing, especially green blue, uh, can just play it almost for free. You always have like a Nervous Gardener. You will most of the time have some kind of other sort of fixing, and Curse to Kill is just good enough, and it costs enough mana for you to be able to play it. Like, you don't want to splash a 2-drop, but splashing a 5-drop with that kind of a massive effect on the game is really good. I mean, among my best versions of Curse to Kill is stealing this Selesnya disguise card that had 7+1/+1 counters on it, and of course it became a 1/1, but it still had 7+1/+1 counters and Death Touch. That was pretty hard for the opponent to deal with. So it can be also like not the complete, like the creature that you steal is not necessarily going to be a 1/1 if you play it right. Let's imagine that you're not one of those 50% win rate players, but you're one of those 55% win rate players that is aspiring to move to that top echelon. Well, if you're in that situation, you better start looking at what the top players are doing differently than you are. And shockingly, A Killer Among Us is still the card that is the biggest difference. So this is the kind of a card that really scales up with your win rate on how frequently you pick it up. 12.5 percentage points difference between the middle tier and top tier players in terms of how frequently they pick the card when they see it. That's quite a lot. This is beyond anything anything that you would expect just from Selesnya being slightly highly picked by the top players. I'm just going to spend a second reading the question. I'm taking Surveillance because they are rare most of the time, so why not? And it gives me options. But if I have a better pick, I'll just pick a better pick if the not both the colors are covered by what I'm playing. It also will depend very frequently on on general feel of the deck. Is like this is a deck that I want to be splashing in. If I'm playing like red white, I'm probably not going to be bothered at all. If I'm playing like blue green and there's a blue or green Surveillance, I'm probably going to pick it. The previous graph, and you still see here Novice Inspector, Inside Source, Neighborhood Garden, Fast Border, Case of the Gateway Express, Thirst to Witness, Dog Walker, Escape Tunnel, and that's more or less it. So despite those middle tier players prioritizing white, you still see that the top tier players are prioritizing it heavier. So if you felt good about yourself in this middle tier and said, "Oh, I prioritized Boros correctly," probably you could do a bit more of it. And I'm, again, stressing it very hard. Don't do it now. The time for that has passed already. But in those first couple of days, you could have probably prioritized it higher. Cryptic Code still highly prioritized by those top players, even higher than the middle tier players prioritized over the bottom tier players. So that's another card that sort of like your appreciation of it scales up with your win rate in the game. What is different here is top players did prioritize Selesnya much more. So they were not a one-trick pony, Neighborhood Guardian, in your face. They were not a one-trick pony. They didn't only force Boros, but they were flexible between Boros and Selesnya. You can see that in cards like Buried in the Garden being drafted higher by the top players than the medium middle tier players. You see Get a Leg Up, the card that we mentioned already, the 1-mana combat trick, getting drafted a bit higher. And another thing that top players do is that they do want to cast their spells. And this is like, I think, a big level up from from this 55% win rate to 60% win rate. Prioritize the ability of casting your spells. And Escape Tunnel, Nervous Gardener, these are the kind of cards that will make that happen. This is good fixing independently if you're playing 2 colors or 3 colors or 5 colors. You want to make sure that you're casting your spells, and getting Nervous Gardeners gives you flexibility in the draft. That you're drafting green green white deck, but you open uh, a gruel rare, you can splash that one mountain and easily play it. Or if you're short on removal, you can pick up the Torch to Witness and splash it off one mountain easily if you have a couple of Nervous Gardeners and an Escape Tunnel in your deck. Topiary Panther is a different topic. We're gonna touch it because there is some subtlety in how the Topiary Panthers are good, and they are good, but they're not universally good. Okay, and then we have the graph that shows the difference between the top players and the 50% win rate tier, and Killer Among Us just 20 percentage points higher drafted by the top players. That's almost twice as frequently, if I remember correctly. It was around 40% of the time that top players see Killer Among Us, they pick it, and it's only 20% for the bottom tier. But this graph is maybe slightly less interesting in the way that lots of those cards we've seen, if not all of them, probably all of them actually. Now, another group of the cards are the cards that are valued low by the top or higher tier players. And here we can look again at the middle versus bottom. So these cards are all taken a bit higher by the bottom tier players. And I think that there is a couple of categories of cards in here. One is cards that offer a dream, in the way that they offer that something very powerful can happen with them in the right circumstances, but very frequently those cards don't do that frequently enough in order to be great. And here we have cards like Case of the Pilfered Proof. That's the card that whenever you play a detective, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. When you have 3 detectives, you get this emblem sort of thingy that whenever you create a token, you also make another extra clue. This card its problem is that it's awkward on the curve. Like, you want to play it on turn 2, but then if you play it on turn 2, you cannot play a 2-drop. And if you don't play a 2-drop, you fall behind in the game. And then maybe those slightly bigger detectives are not giving you enough. Like, you probably have some novice inspectors in your deck, and then you play it on turn 1, and then in turn 2 you play the Case of the Pilfered Proof, so you didn't get the value from it. And then you really need to know how to play this card in order to maximize the value. And you need a lot of detectives, and frequently you would just not get enough of those in order for the card to be good. So this card is picked slightly higher by the bottom tier players. Another card that offers a dream and definitely doesn't deliver is Mistway Spy. That's the 1-mana 1/1 flyer, but it also can be casted as a disguise creature and flipped for 2 mana. And when it's flipped, until end of turn, creatures you control gain whenever it deals damage. You get a clue. And this offers like this dream, oh, I'm going to flip it and attack with 4 creatures, and they're going to connect, and I'm going to get 4 clues, and yay. But most of the time, you will do that, and then they will be blocked. Maybe you get 1 clue, and 1 clue is not enough to compensate for the fact that you just paid 5 mana for a 1/1 flyer. So yeah, not great. What else do we have here? No More Lies. That's another card, in my opinion, that offers a dream. And this is a slightly different type of a dream. It's a kind of a card that is good in constructed, or is going to be good in constructed. And people know that. And because they think, like, I think that this is one of the beginner limited players kind of misconception, is that limited is a weaker format, and therefore things that are strong in constructed are going to be strong in limited because, well, it's a lower power thing. So in the lower power thing, the things that are good in the higher power thing are going to be even better. But it's not exactly true for every card, because limited is not only weaker than constructed in terms of deck power, but it's also different than constructed in terms of how the decks are built. The constructed decks are super streamlined, so you're always getting good target for the No More Lies. In limited, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a good target for it, and if you don't think that the target is good enough, you will skip playing No More Lies. And what that makes to you is you didn't spend 2 mana on your turn, or in your turn cycle. And if you spend less mana than your opponent does, well, you're going to lose that game, because they deploy more threats, more kind of like value on the board, and then they're going to run you over. So that's the problem with a card like No More Lies. Murder, that's a different type. That's a card that is good historically, and if you don't take into account that history is currently in the process of shifting, you might play Murder too much. The card is the highest picked card in the format in terms of commons, and it has a pretty poor win rate. So you have to sacrifice a high pick to get it, and then you get a very low value of it because Murder in this set is problematic. Like lots of creatures are small, you don't want to murder them. Bunch of creatures are disguised, so you need to pay 5 mana to kill them with Murder. That's a lot. And if they flip, they probably gain some value because most of the cards they do something when they flip. So you will only spend the whole card to kill like between half and 75% of a card. Not good. It will still be good. Don't get me wrong. It's just it's not that amazing. I mean, if you play black, you probably want to have one copy or something, but maybe even two. But one for one dealing in the reality where most of the things accrue some extra value when they come in, it's just not a good deal because what you have a murder in your hand and opponent plays three novice inspectors. Do you feel good killing one of those novice inspectors with murder? Not necessarily, especially that they got clues with it. Some other cards, another dream card is Forum Familiar. That's the 3 mana morph disguised creature. Flips for 2. It's a 1/1, but when it flips, it gets +1/+1 counter, so it's a 2/2 when it flips. Yay. And when it flips, it also returns something, a permanent you control to your hand. This again, it's 5 mana for that effect. Like flicker effects are not great when they are costing 2 mana, and on a 2/2 creature, that would mean that I'd probably you should pay maximum like 4 mana for it. Preferably like 3.5. I think 3 would be probably too good. You can get some value, and you can imagine scenarios when it's going to be just absolutely broken. You just do your Forum Familiar, you return a Killer Among Us, you get more tokens, whatever, or some other card that accrues a lot of value on ETB. You play Makeshift Binding, exile a detective token, you bounce it back, you replay it, and you kill a real creature with it. Value. But in reality, it's going to play much worse than that. It's going to be, you can't play it as a 1-drop because that's just a vanilla 1/1, not good enough. A 3 mana, a 2/2, it's not so good. You don't want to put it in combat because then how are you going to accrue your value? So maybe you want to play it later in the game, but then what's the point of playing it at all? And that's probably why the middle players are sort of not playing it too much. And the 50% win rate tier is doing much more than that. And the other group of cards that I put here are the expensive ones, and that's Wisp Drinker Vampire, which is a good card. Again, don't get me wrong, I like Wisp Drinker Vampire. That's the 2/4 in Orzhov that with flying. That whenever your creature with power 2 or less ETBs under your control, you drain opponent for 1, and it has like a 7-mana ability that all your small creatures get lifelink and death touch until end of turn. It's good, but I think that maybe those 50% win rate players are picking it as a sort of reason to be Orzhov, while I think that it should be picked more like a reward for being in the Orzhov lane and getting them late. Because if you pick it as a reason, you have to pick it higher. And then you maybe end up in a not so great lane because Orzhov is not the strongest of the white archetypes. And because of that, you will have slightly weaker decks because you sort of get so excited about getting Whisperinker Vampire that you stop to think about should I be trying to be Orzhov at all. And a couple of other cards in this category, I think Harry Dronesmith, that's another 4-drop. 4 drops, they need to do really a lot in the modern Magic to be good, because 4-drop is this awkward place where it's too expensive to reliably be able to cast it every time on curve, because sometimes you will not hit that fourth land. They need to be really good at blocking, and Wisbreaker Vampire arguably is a decent blocker, so that's fine. Harry Dronesmith, do you want to put it in harm's way when they are attacking with the 2/2? I mean, they are attacking with the 2/2. That looks pretty scary when they do that. They probably have something that might kill it, so you probably don't want to block it. And then if your 4-drop cannot block really, it's problematic. And then Night Drinker Moroi, that's even bigger problem. It's like a 4-mana 4/2 flyer, and you can flip it, not to lose life at ETB. If you play it just as a creature, you lose life. This is a card that probably would be great if there was like a super aggro version of Black Deck. But apart from some Rakdos builds, it doesn't exist. And still in that deck, do you want to play a 4-drop that dies to shock? It's problematic, to say the least. And there's a bunch of cards in this set that in this list also that I think are just slightly not on plan. Not on my watch is a prime example of that. It's a white card that exiles attacking creatures, while most good white decks in the format, they want to be attacking themselves, which means that frequently you will just not have a target for it because you're pushing attacks. And if you have a target, it's probably because you are playing this card, because if you had a 2-drop or a 3-drop instead of it, you would be still attacking, right? Right now, you're running out of steam and you have to use this defensive card that is not on your plan in order to in order to stop opponent from attacking. So you're definitely going against what you should be planning in those decks. Now let's look at the difference between top and the middle tier players. And here we see a slightly different pattern. We still see some of the same cards. We see the Harry Dronesmith, we see the Bolrak Clan Basher. That's the 3/2 double strike trampler that can flip for 6 mana from Disguise. This card, again, it's quite expensive, and that's, I think, the big problem of it. You want to be filling your deck with the 2-drops, and probably you can get better 6-drops than the Bolrak Clan Basher in most decks. We see, I guess, that the equivalent of murder in this list is Soul Enervation, the black flash enchantment that gives -4/-4 to a target creature. That's highly valued by the middle tier players, but not so much by the top tier players. Apart from that, you see a bunch of rare cards, and I would say good to decent rares, and actually very high win rate rares in some cases, like Pyrotechnic, Performer, and Krenko are having really great win rate. And also by the top players, they just don't pick them that highly. They will not change how they're drafting to pick up Pyrotechnic, Performer. They will not change how they're drafting to pick up Krenko. And I think that some of the middle tier players will do that. And that's, I think, accounts for the quite large part of the difference. Krenko's Bus Crusher is a particular example. There's a 10 percentage point difference, because this is not only the situation when sometimes you would have to shift how you're drafting in order to pick Krenko's Bus Crusher to get the 4/4 flyer in your deck, because, well, let's be honest, the other ability is probably non-existent in limited environment. But Krenko's Bus Crusher is actually not that great of a card. It's decent. It's a 4-mana 4/4 flyer, but it's not amazing. And I think that those middle tier players are treating it as an amazing card and are willing to go out of their way to pick it, while the top players, I'm in red. I'm happily picking Krenko's Bus Crusher. I'm not in the red. I can happily pick a Nervous Gardener over it, because that's a better card in this particular situation. So I think that here we can see that the top players, in case of those non-bomb rares, are not willing to go out of the way to draft around them. And I think that the definition of what a bomb rare is specific. Cards like Krenko, especially, which is a bomb. Unambiguously, it has a very high win rate for every single group of players. Actually, top players win with it way more than any other group. But I think that they do it because they very selectively pick it and put it in the decks where it's going to shine the most, which means decks that will have ways of sacrificing artifacts, and decks that are aggressive on top of that, and that will benefit from having Krenko in them, because you can generate those 1/1 goblins. Not on my watch. The card was a difference in the previous graph, and card is a difference still. So it seems like this is the kind of a card that progresses. Your evaluation of it will change and become lower and lower in this particular case, as your win rate is higher and higher. And in case of the Pilfered proved the same. We saw that card before, and we see it again. It's even less valued by the top players group than it was by the middle player group. And here we have this complete comparison. Two cards that are, there's 5 cards that are generally very much less valued by the top players compared to the bottom players. Mistway Spy, Harry Dronesmith, Bolrak Clan Basher, Krenko's Bus Crusher, and Night Drinker Moroi. These are cards that will probably appeal to the 50% win rate players more. And if you are in that group, think why they appeal to you, and think why don't they appeal to this top win rate players group, despite some of them being in one of the better colors in red. So yeah, there's food for thought for you. Right, now we move to win rate, because of course picking a card is part of the battle. The other part is actually winning games with those cards. So let's look which cards have the highest difference in win rate between the middle and bottom tier. As we said in the beginning, the bottom tier has roughly 48% average win rate. The middle tier has roughly 55% win rate. So the average difference in win rate is 7 percentage points. So anything above that is going to be disproportionately different in terms of the win rate. And we have card number one is Benthic Criminologist. That's a 5-mana 5/4 that allows you to sacrifice clues for free once in a while. This card is based on very small sample size, so I wouldn't put too much credibility to this result. It's there, so I put it, but I'm not willing to speculate on it because there can be just explained by pure variance, which is something that is boring but exists, and it's good for you to know that variance can impact the results of any kind of analysis. Okay. So the card that has the biggest win rate is actually Flourishing Bloomkin, which makes you think that this is a card that's maybe not straightforward to use. If you are in that 50% win rate tier, roughly, you may want to think about how you play the Flourishing Bloomkin. Am I playing it right? Am I playing it correct? What do other people do? How do I want to play it? Do I want to play it as a 2-drop? Sometimes probably I do. Do I want to wait for it, slow roll it, and flip it in the right moment? Do I want to chump block it on occasions, or do I always want to accrue all the value? Think about how you're playing, and then think maybe how can you play it differently. Because this result indicates to me that there is potential for this card to be played in a wrong way, and it seems that those 50% win rate tier players are doing it once in a while. And very similar, you will see in lots of those cards, is that they can be used in multiple ways, and they need maybe a bit building around and careful deck construction, and because of that they become harder to play. Because we have cards like Reckless Detective. This is also a tricky card to play. Do I attack? Do I sacrifice an artifact? Do I rummage? Do I keep it back? All those decisions need to be made. Another card like this, Unyielding Gatekeeper. It's very often that you can play it just as a 2-mana free 2, and start bashing. But maybe those bottom tier players are frequently playing it as a morph and want to get the max value out of it. Do you frequently use the option to blink one of your creatures instead of exiling something and giving your opponent a 2/2? Remember that if you kill their 3/3 and turn it into a 2/2, it basically gave -1/-1 to something, which is not that great a deal. It's frequently better to blink your creature and save it from removal than to put a -1/-1 counter on something in practical terms. Coerced to Kill. I think that this card has a big difference in win rate because the bottom tier players will play it in their Dimir decks, while the middle tier players will play Coerced to Kill in maybe their Simic decks and splash it. And Simic decks are just better, and because of the composition of the decks that is being played in the particular group, there is going to be a difference in the win rate. And we have a couple of other build-arounds. Krenko, Crime Novelist. It seems that the Gleaming Geardrake kind of situation decks are trickier to build by those 50% win rate players. Another card that I think is important to mention here is Person of Interest. If I would be a betting person, which I'm arguably not, I think that the difference in the win rate comes from Person of Interest being good in a particular deck and not universally good. Person of Interest is a very good aggressive card, but it's a pretty bad defensive card because for 4 mana I got a 2/2. on the defense, which is not great. And you get this useless, suspected kind of 2/2 you don't care about if you're playing a defensive deck. And I think that might account at least for some of the difference. Okay. But yeah, as you can see, lots of those cards on the list are having a bunch of options on them, like Corvot Haunch. Do I sacrifice it? Do I equip it? Do I make the 1/1s, or do I just keep it for later? All those choices are tricky, and if you're just learning, it's going to be natural that the more choices you have in your deck, the more mistakes you're likely to be making, because you will have some percentage of the time that you're going to make a mistake, and that percentage is going to be slightly higher than the top players, and therefore the more choices you give to yourself, the bigger the chance of running into a mistake scenario. In terms of the difference between top and middle players, we have some interesting cards in there. Here we see really the sort of complicated cards on the list that distinguish between top and middle players. The difference between those two groups is 5 percentage points. So here we have cards that are between 8.3 and 6.7 percentage points higher win rate. And I think that, like, realistically, those cards below 7%, they can be within the realm of variance in terms of the win rate difference. But still worth noting, Proft's Eidetic Memory is the biggest win rate difference card. I think that this is a very particularly difficult card to play, because you need to know when to draw cards, you need to plan ahead your turns, you need to know on which turn you want to be playing it. This is the enchantment that you investigate, and then whenever you draw an extra card on your turn, when you attack, put that many +1/+1 counters on target creature as cards that you drew. So yeah, realistically, this is like a turn 4 play. When you play this, sacrifice a clue, swing with something, make it bigger. But it can be complex to weave it into your mana curve, maybe at a later stage when the board is a bit so you really need to be thinking, where do I want to find time to cast this spell? Definitely not early, but maybe sometimes you do. Anyway, second card on the list is Aftermath Analyst. That's the 1/3 that mills you for free, and you can sacrifice it for 4 mana and bring back all the basic lands onto the battlefield from your, or all the lands from your graveyard onto the battlefield. Tricky card to play. Also is notoriously part of tricky decks, because it will want to have some collect evidence. It will want maybe to have some graveyard synergies. These decks are a bit more difficult to play, so there might be just like an intrinsic skill level issue with Aftermath Analyst, that it does require a much more intensive gameplay, and also almost guaranteed that it will be played in slower decks, which are also notoriously harder to play, because they force you to make more important decisions, and they force you to play very specifically in the first turns, something that might not be supernatural. Vitu-Ghazi Inspector, that's another card like an Aftermath Analyst, in a way that it will want to be played in those more complicated decks. Case of the Pilfered Proof is one of the biggest difference. That shows you that this card does require skill to play it correctly, and does require selection to play it correctly, because if you remember, those top players played the card much less frequently than the other groups of players. So Case of the Pilfered Proof requires probably knowing what is a good home for it. And we have Topiary Panther. I think that maybe middle tier players will play it frequently in decks that doesn't want it, which would be, for example, Selesnya decks that don't want particularly to play Topiary Panther. You want to be playing it when that line cycling is important as a mode for the card. Wisp Drinker Vampire, again, complicated plans with that card. Drafting the white-black decks is not super straightforward, so you have that card. You have to, think about how to draft it. Also, you need to be selective when you draft it and when you want to play it. And I think that top players do it much better. They know exactly when they are in the Wisp Drinker Vampire deck, and then it becomes much better, rather than becoming an Orzhov deck because you saw the Wisp Drinker Vampire, which might not be the best strategy. Repulsive Mutation, another card with many choices. Counter, combat trick, when to cast it, when to withhold it, when to ignore it. It's a fun card, but it does put a lot of decisions in front of you. And also, in this set, that definitely auto tapper has spoiled many a repulsive mutation from being cast because for some reasons auto tapper is not working particularly well in this particular format. We have Krenko. I already talked about Krenko. Selection on when to play it is very important for those top players. Do it better, it seems, thus having a higher delta and win rate. And then we have cards that I would be careful about making any speculations on because they are just within those below those 7% win rate difference. Okay. And just to notice which cards are the biggest difference between the top and the bottom players, we have Unyielding Gatekeeper as the biggest difference card, and I think that especially this mode of playing it as a 2 mana 3/2 is probably underused by the bottom tier players because that's not straightforward. You want to get all the value that you want. Sometimes best value is going face, and that's what this card does really well. Krenko, top tier players select carefully when they put Krenko in their deck and make it better because of that. And Benthic Criminologist, small sample size. So again, interesting point, and that means that there might be some really good Benthic Criminologist niche deck that those top players are forcing, maybe even because it's a small sample size. One player is setting the trend for that card. Who knows? Yeah, and these are the three that are really outstandingly higher win rate. And the rest, we've seen all those cards really. There's the Bloomkin, there is the Reckless Detective, Galvanize. We didn't see, but it does win more because I think that this is a complex card hidden under the guise of a very simple deal 3 to a target creature kind of situation. Gleaming Drake, No More Lies, all these cards we've seen. Aftermath Analyst, Gearbane Orangutan. I think that this card is same case as Krenko. It's well selected when you play that card when you're a top player, and it will be good in some decks, but it's a small subset of them. And because of that, I think that bottom tier players will be more likely to put this card generically into a red deck, which probably is not such a great idea. Okay, and here we move to the cards with the smallest difference between the groups. Just to maybe identify which cards are where in terms of best skill level kind of difference. Have you thought about implications of being double spellable as something that you should increase the value of 1-2 casting cost, sometimes 3 casting cost cards? Yeah, but it sort of goes by the way of everything. I don't think that you have to put particular weight on that, but you should definitely think of building decks that are capable of that. I think that that's as far as I would go. So here we have the cards that have smaller differences in win rate between middle and the bottom tier. Eliminate the Impossible is the least of the difference. I have no idea why. I think that card that will always do similar things, and I think that the problem that the bottom tier level players have is not playing it frequently enough, so it might suffer from a small sample size. We have a bunch of cards in this list that are in the category, these cards are just very good and they don't require too much philosophy. You just play them and it's good. And here we have cards like 10th District Hero, Private Eye, Tolsimir, Midnight Slide, Teysa, Opulent Oligarch, War Leader's Call, Fast Bother. I think that those cards are just generically good, and you can play them better, but I don't think that you can't play it that worse. So War Leader Score, especially, you put an Anthem, you put pinging effect on your creatures when they ETB. Private Eye, just make your things bigger, and it's a good creature on rate on its own. Tolsimir, yeah, you just put 2 gigantic bodies on board and hopefully take the game over from that step. Teysa, just slowly accrue value. All those cards are just generically so good that independent of the skill level, they carry the decks that they are in. You have some cards that probably the middle tier players are trying to be too cute with, and therefore lose some games with them. I think that particularly Case of the Pilfered Proof might be one of those cards. Festerleach might be one of those cards. I would expect that those cards will not be flat power level between the middle and top tier, which means that these are the cards that if you're the 55% win rate person, you should be looking at how you play them. I'm talking about Unscrupulous Agent. Maybe you're not getting value from that. Karlov Watchdog. Maybe you're putting it in the wrong decks, as this is mainly Boros / Selesnya card. You shouldn't be probably playing it in like your Azorius decks, for example. In terms of the difference between top and middle, here we have cards that almost have no difference. Coerce to Kill, Aurelia. These are just powerful cards, and I think that middle tier players um, can use those cards pretty well. Tolsimir we see again on the list. It's just raw power is just so good that it's hard to misplay it. Cryptic Code, same situation. Krenko's Bust Crusher, maybe not like super busted, but at least the power level of this card is very flat. You're asking your opponent the question, do you have an artifact removal or removal for it? If not, then I'm probably going to win this game. So it doesn't require that much skill. Just have 4 mana on board and cast it. Long Goodbye, just generically good removal. The fact that it cannot be countered removes a bunch of skill issues of playing it into ward, for example, or something. So yeah, bunch of bombs here again in Cryptic Code, Aurelia, and Courage to Kill, which I count as a sort of bomb. Market Watch Phantom, a very simple play style card. You play it on turn 2. There's no philosophy in that, and from then on you start casting creatures with power 2 or less, and just swing in the air with a 2/2 flyer. Not much philosophy in that, and you can see that in the flat win rate between the top players. You cannot squeeze out more out of it, and it's hard to misplay it. I think that one of the concepts that you should be thinking on that, especially when you're in this top win rate player, is the concept that I heard Ham TV talking about. Hopefully, I'm going to ship you to Ham after the seminar. And this is why he doesn't play particular cards. And he says, look, this card, it does what it says. I can't get much more out of it than what it says. I want to play cards that do decent stuff, but played well, they do even more stuff. They have the synergistic effect between your skill level and what the card does, where you can have more out of it because of how good you're playing. And because of that, he maximizes his win rate because he picks those cards that have this kind of a positive enforcement because his skill level is going to make them shine even more. It's very hard to make Market Watch Phantom shine more than what it does. I'm not saying it's a bad card. It's a good card. It's just like it's very hard to squeeze out more out of it. And some of those cards are just very powerful, which makes them very hard to squeeze out more out of them because they are already so good. And here we have the cards that have the smallest difference in win rate between the top and the bottom tier. And here you see Tolsimir Midnight Light. How powerful is this card? Only 5 percentage point difference between the people with 47% win rate and people with 60% win rate, which is in a way impressive. And how powerful is that? And we still see Private Eye. We see 10th District Hero. All those cards have a relatively small win rate. So win the difference between top and bottom. And also Novice Inspector, which shows you that this card maybe is not intuitive why it's so good, and lower win rate players don't play it as frequently as they should. But when they play it, the card performs so well for them that the difference between its win rate between them and the top win rate players is only 9%. Colin is asking how many of those small differences cards are low performers. Yeah, it would be a good mixture of those two categories: cards that are really good performers and cards that are really low performers. And you put the example of the Harry Dronesmith. Harry Dronesmith is a card that is specific for a particular version of the Izzet deck, and I think that top players will be able to hopefully figure out how this card can be pretty good, while other groups of players will maybe not. I think my basically capability of talking is at its limits, so we'll finish it here. We finished it here because also I'm running out of slides. There is no more. So I would like to thank the 17 Lands team for designing those tiers and getting the data that has more granularity for me to analyze. That's amazing that they did it. Especially Viral Misnomer and Ale Ballini are the most active 17 Lands developers right now, I think. Thanks to Fake Jake Brown, who is enjoying his well-deserved holiday. And yeah, and thanks to Asescu and Malajanki for the music I use in my podcast version of it. And with that, oh, of course, thanks to mtgazone.com and thanks to my patrons. And with that, I'll see you next week when we're gonna talk about the non-disclosed topic that I still have to figure out. And with that, see you next week.